Today's shiur begins at the lower part of Daf Lamed Aleph Omid Beis. 5 lines from the bottom, a quote from the Mishnah, Habo al achoisoi, v'al achois ovid v'chulei. The Mishnah listed a number of prohibited women where he raped them. Prohibited means prohibited in marriage. Of course, rape itself is forbidden under all circumstances, but these are women that are arayas, they're forbidden relatives, and they are punishable by kores. And the Mishnah indicated that these women will generate a knas payment. The rapist will have to pay 50 shekel kesef, 50 shekel silver pieces. And he has to pay that to the father of the girl. The topic at hand, we mentioned at the end of our previous shiur, is a very long topic, and it would be one of the longest sugyas in Shas. You can see on the side of the Gemara under our nosei, our topic heading, we indicate it goes until Lamed Hey Omid Beis. Here we are at the bottom of Lamed Aleph Omid Beis. So you can see that it's about a 4 daf sugya. Yishuv stira bein mishnaseinu. We're here to resolve what appears to be a contradiction between our Mishnah, shemechayev tashlum knas al habo al achoisai, where you are obligated, in the case of the rape, to pay the fine of 50 pieces of silver for one who rapes his sister and other similar relatives. And that's our Mishnah's point of view. Lebein Mishnah de Makis, there's a Mishnah in Maseches Makis, the Habo al achoisai loike, that one who would rape his sister will be penalized with lashing. The thinking right now is that if one is going to get lashed, so he will not have to pay. It's basically one or the other. So that's, of course, something that will come under discussion. Just from a general structural standpoint, in the context of these recordings, we're presenting this in the Daf Yomi format. Truth be told, it would be easier if we were able to learn all 4 dapim in one shot, thereby making the cross-referencing easier. But we are in the context of a Daf Yomi style shiur, so it's important for anyone who is listening to hear the whole story straight through, and unfortunately people who pick up later for the first time will be losing out a great deal. So now we turn to the Gemara, the text, Habo al achosov al achosovid v'chulei. We said, the Mishnah said he's mishalim knas v'raminu. Here we're reading the 4 lines from the bottom, last word on the line. We raise a contradiction. This is a long question, which takes us to the top of Lamed Beis Omid Aleph. The Mishnah in Maseches Makis says, Elu hein halokin. The following are examples of people that will get lashed. Now, lashing is a court-administered punishment. It cannot be administered unless there's a formal warning before the offender commits the transgression. And the warning states that if you do such and such, in this case, if you have intimacy with one sister, you will be subject to lashing. And the criminal, the sinner, hears that and says, well, I don't care. He goes ahead and does it anyway. He will be guilty of lashing. He'll be punishable by lashing. So it says in the Mishnah, the following get lashed. Habo al achoisoi, v'al achois oviv, v'al achos imo, v'al achos ishto, v'al eishes ochiv, v'al eishes achi oviv, v'al hanida. One who has intimacy with any of these relatives, they're the same, basically the same relatives appeared in our Mishnah, and it's added here in one who has relations with a nida, a woman who is impure as a result of her female monthly cycle. And we continue at the top of Lamed Beis Omid Aleph, the kaimolon the eno loke mishalim, and we hold that one would not get malchus and pay as well. So the Mishnah in Makis says that there is lashing for Bo Ala Choso. I'm not deliberately not going over all the relatives name by name or translation by translation, simply to keep things as simple as possible. So our Mishnah for a brother raping his sister will, according to our Mishnah, pay the fine, the knas, and according to the Mishnah Makis, he will get lashed. And we're making this assumption that it's when it says lashing, you would not get lashed and also have to pay. So it's saying only lashing. Our Mishnah is then saying only paying. That would be a contradiction. Take note of the amazing structure. We have a mivneh, a structural note on the side, and note it indicates until Lamed Hey Amid Aleph. The crown shape will be reserved for what we've written on the side, Drochim liyashiv astir bein mishnoseinu lemishnah b'maseches makis. These are approaches to resolve the seeming contradiction between the two mishnayos. And this crown shape continues to appear, as we indicate, until Daf Lamed Hey Omid Beis. Rabba's name will appear there as number 4. But until then, we have here on the top of Lamed Beis Amid Aleph Ula, and on Lamed Beis Amid Beis, 5 lines from the top, you will see Reb Yochanan, and on Lamed Gimel Amid Beis, you will see Reish Lakish. And Rashi on Lamed Gimel Amid Beis is sensitive to the fact that we're so far flung. By the time you get to Lamed Gimel Amid Beis, that's it's quite a distance from where the sugya began on Lamed Aleph Amid Beis, 2 dapim later practically. And Rashi there on Lamed Gimel Amid Beis says explicitly on the lower half of the page, Reish Lakish Mahadir Ashinu Derumya Deramina Bereish Maitin Masnisin Demakis Kesubos, where Reish Lakish he too comes to resolve the contradiction. So, as I say many times in Gemara markings, that by learning Rashi you see a justification for the marking system. The Gemara continues at the top of Lamed Beis Amid Aleph, after we pointed out that Ula is the first one of these. So, Omar Ula Loi Kashya. There's no contradiction. Kan ba'choisoi nara, kan ba'choisoi boigeres. Our Mishnah is where payment is made, is where he rapes his sister that is still a nara. She's between ages 12 and 12 and a half. And only up till 12 and a half can we talk about a knas payment. Beyond that, the Torah doesn't provide for a knas payment. The knas is often translated as the fine, the set 50 shekel piece, 50 shekel silver pieces, a set amount for rape that's only for a nara, not for a bogeres. And hence the Mishnah in Makis, in Maseches Makis, talks about someone having raped his sister, a bogeres. And therefore it's loke v'eno misham. There's nothing to pay. There's no knas. Therefore, if there's no financial punishment, there is room then for the lashing punishment. The Gemara in the next couple lines has a series of questions, back and forth, question, answer, on this very answer. You're telling me right now that the Mishnah Makis says lashing because there's no payment. Achoso bogeres nami, but even in the case of achoso bogeres is a girl over 12 and a half. Ha'ika boishes upegam, there are additional payments to the 50 shekel kesef of the knas. There are, in general tort law, when a person inflicts injury on his fellow man, there's a series of payments. In fact, there are 5 payments, and each one is referred to by name. There's tsar, boishes, nezek, pagam, and ripui. Those are 5 payments, each one addressing a different need or a different loss that the victim suffers as a result of being attacked or accosted by the perpetrator. So in the case of a rape, there are other things that take place. The knas is a blanket payment. Maybe it's an imposed automatic payment in the case of a rape of a na'ara. But even in the case of the na'ara, in all rape cases, there's the pain, there's the depreciation. A girl who is a virgin is worth more, so to speak, and that is a topic that's worthy of further expansion, but we're going to simply view it as an additional payment for right now without explaining the depth of that. There's compensation for being immobilized, when a person is, we'll call workman's compensation. There's medical expenses. There's embarrassment that one receives compensation for. There are a whole bunch of other payments that the Gemara is going to refer to right now in our context. So how can you say that Bogeres is going to get lashed because there's no payment when there still is the Boshes Upagam payment? Boshes is payment for embarrassment, and Pagam is a payment for depreciation. So the Gemara says, well, the Mishnah in Makis that says there's Malchus, and we're understanding Malchus because there is no payment to be made, is because B'shoita. We're talking about the girl was a fool, an imbecile, and as such, she doesn't experience embarrassment, and she doesn't experience depreciation. But is there not pain? So the Gemara says, well, the pain, that also generates a payment. So the Gemara says, no, b'mefuta, there she was seduced. And there's a difference between the act of a forced rape and a seduction, where at the point of intimacy you essentially have a willing, agreeing female partner, because she is being seduced. She's agreeing at that point. So the tsar aspect is not present. So what is the Mishnah in Makis describing? It's describing there is lashing because there is no payment to be made. We're talking about a bogeres, which eliminates the knas. She's an imbecile, which eliminates the boishes ubagam payment, and she's been seduced and not raped. And seduction also is something that is when you're dealing with a seduction, there's a payment that is ordered. If you're dealing with a young girl when she's a katana or a nara, that's mefuta payment. A payment is made to her father, but there's no payment because she's a bogeres. So, and there's no tsar, as we said, because she's agreeing at that point to the act. So, since there's no payment to be made in the case, in the type of situation of Maseches Makis, so there is lashing that we punish the perpetrator with. Hashta de osis lahachi. Now that we've arrived at this point, afilu temo achoso nara. The Mishnah in Maseches Makis doesn't have to be set up specifically with a bogeres case, the girl over 12 and a half. Notice on the third line from the top we underline that. That's how we thought to set up the Mishnah in Makis. At this point we dash line nara. No, we can say that the Mishnah in Makis is talking about the younger type girl, under 12 and a half. However, there's no payment because b'yisoma umefuta. Yisoma means there's no father. Ordinarily, the father would receive the payment up till the end of the nara's period, but she's yisoma. She doesn't have a father, so all the money would have been paid to her. However, umefuta, she's a consenting partner at that point. She's being seduced, and as a result of the consent, so there is no payment that is made. If she were a consenting partner, but her father was alive, her father obviously doesn't approve of this, so he would receive the payment. But here she is the one that's agreeing to it. Therefore, there's a forfeit of payment. The perpetrator, though, has to be punished, and he gets malchus. Al-Mukasovar Ula. From this entire discussion, we can now say, by way of a rule concerning Ula set up the Mishnah in Makis, specifically set it up as a bogeres, and he sets up the Mishnayos where there was warning ahead of time. Obviously, as we said before, you couldn't give Malchus if there was no warning. There was warning. And our Mishnah too, there was a warning ahead of time. And yet, in our Mishnah, since there was room for meting out a financial punishment, even though there was a potential for Malchus in the sense that there was a warning given before the act was done, we make the following rule. We state the following rule. Ula holds, kol heicha de'ika momenu Malchus, where you have a situation that both punishments, in theory, could be meted out, and that is the case with regard to our Mishnah here in Maseches Kesubos. There was a warning that gives room for the Malchus to be executed, and the other factors that our Mishnah was dealing with, a Na'ara who was raped. There's a financial aspect. Mamona mishalem milkuloloki. Once again, let's read that line again. Kol hecha diiko mamona malchus. Wherever you have a situation that one of these two punishments could be meted out, mamona mishalem milkuloloki. The money punishment is to be meted out, and thereby foregoing the need for lashing. At this point, we're going to just take a step back for some structural observation. We have a number of different markings. You see a squiggle underline, and that highlights the expression alma kosovar. You see a double underline, mamona mishali milka loloki. If you have Omid Beis readily available, and of course we always recommend printing out the daf or having an entire Masechta available with markings in it. If you look at this Daf Lamed Beis Omid Beis, you see 5 lines from the top, Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, we should point out that on Daf Lamed Beis Omid Aleph, the point that we just read, there starts then a long bracketed section. This long bracketed section is designed for us to be able to go immediately to see an alternative approach to the resolution of the two sources, and that's Rabbi Yochanan on Omid Beis. So if you were to hold these two dapim side by side, Lamed Beis Omid Aleph and Lamed Beis Omid Beis, if you printed them out, you can hold them side by side. Rabbi Yochanan also appears in a crown shape, and he's number 2. He too is there to resolve the Mishnah in Makis with our Mishnah. But before we get into any text, look at the markings alone. Notice there's a squiggle underline 2 lines under Rabbi Yochanan. Alma Kosov Rabbi Yochanan. That squiggle underline is parallel to the squiggle underline here with Ula, where we say Alma Kosov Ula. Now, what is the result of Rabbi Yochanan's resolution, which we did not read yet? The result of his resolution is, notice the double underline, Milke Loki Mamoino Lo Mishalem. That is the opposite of what Ula had concluded. Ula said, Mamona Mishale Milka Lo Loki. He says, Milka Loki, there is lashing and no mamon, meaning that where you have an opportunity to give either one or the other, Rabbi Yochanan will say you will opt to give the lashing and not the money payment. Now, we've skipped to Lamed Beis Omid Beis. Let's look at Rabbi Yochanan. Let's look at the text. Rabbi Yochanan Omar. Again, we're reading 5 lines from the top of Lamed Beis Omid Beis. Rabbi Yochanan Omar. Afilu temo achoso nara. Not like Ula had originally said that the Mishnah in Makis is talking about a bogeres. No, the Mishnah in Makis is talking about a na'ara, the girl up till age 12 and a half. A sister was raped by her brother. Kan shehisrubo, kan shelo hisrubo. The Mishnah in Makis, there was warning. Now, when we say afilu tema chosonara, that means that there is a potential for knas. That there is a knas potential. And nevertheless, our Mishnah says there's payment. Why? Because kan shelo hisrubo. In our Mishnah there was no warning. Since there was no warning, you can't give the malchus. So default, you make the knas payment. the Mishnah in Makis, there was warning, so that even though there was a knas possibility, because it was a na'ara, nevertheless we will give malchus and not the payment. Oh, so the Mishnah in Makis represents a case where there was a potential for payment because you were dealing with a na'ara. There was also malchus because there was warning. What conclusion can you reach regarding Rabbi Yochanan? And this is where we squiggle underline. Al lo kasov Rabbi Yochanan. Kol hechodika momena malchus, where there's the possibility of either money or malchus. The asru bay, and there had been a warning. Obviously, without the warning, there couldn't be malchus. So, by saying there is malchus, that's already subsumes that there was asru bay. Milke loki mamoina lo mishalem. The punishment that the court will opt for is the lashing and no payment. Payment is made only when I couldn't give malchus, but if I could give malchus, if I can administer lashing, that's what we will do. After that, later the Gemara goes on to ask, Mino Leilu Rabbi Yochanan Ha, you can see a trapezoid shape, a volcano shape around that. Well, notice in our Gemara, where we left off on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, the same shape. That's because the Gemara here is asking, Mino Le L'Ula Ha. How does Ula know that when you have Momon and Malchus, we opt for the Momon and not the Malchus? When we get to Rabbi Yochanan, how do you know that according to Rabbi Yochanan, you opt for the malchus and not the moment? So what we noted on the side of the Gemara is that these markings, the squiggle underline, the double underline, the volcano shape, these are designed to show the balance or similarity in structure between these two sections of Gemara. Now that we've laid out the superstructure of today's, of this part of the shiur, we now go back to the bracketed section, and we have a starred note on the side which reads, Matris HaSograim, the purpose of these brackets, Lahatzmid HaGishas Shel Ula L'Shel Rabbi Yochanan, to connect, to place side by side Ula's approach to the resolution of the contradiction and Rabbi Yochanan, which we already did. But Soicha within the bracketed section, Gemara Mevareres B'Shlavim, Mao Amoker L'Divrei Ula. The Gemara will go through in a stage-by-stage process what is the basis, what's the source for Ula. So that having been said, we also mentioned the trapezoid, Minole, etc. Here, Minole L'Ulaha. From where does Ula know that you give the Momon punishment and not the Malchus punishment when either one could have been administered? The triangle is featured on the side, Shuvos la she'ela minol le'lu. These are responses to that particular question. From where does Ula know this? But now it appears in stages. And that's why you see a numbering scheme, which takes us till the upper part of Omid Beis, till number 4. So we have to bear with the Gemara. It takes a while to develop the final, till we get to the final answer. How does Ula know? Mamona Mishale Milkalo Lucky. At the end of each suggested answer, there you'll see a dashed underline. The dashed underlining represents pirchos, a challenge, an undoing, a question on whatever answer was given at each stage. So how does Ula know that when you can administer, as by way of punishment, either malchus or momon, we charge the person the money, to pay the money, and not the malchus? So answer number 1, or stage 1, Gomar mechovel b'chavero. He cites or uses as a precedent the way the Torah treats someone who injures his friend. Chovel b'chavero, chovel chavola. He hits his friend, he injures his friend through impact. What happens? Ma chovel b'chavero di'iko momono malchus. Just like in the case of accosting an individual, there are actually 2 things or 2 punishments that are in store. There's the financial loss that you cause the individual, the need to compensate him for the assault, And Malchus, there's a negative command in the Torah that has been violated. And the negative command we will refer to just by two simple words, Lo Yosef. That's the command, without getting into the background, or maybe just a word about the background. The Torah, when talking to the court about administering lashings, the court is commanded, do not give more than the amount he is to receive. So more than that would be not the punishment of the Torah, it would be simple beating the guy. So we call Lo Yosef, means don't go beyond the number. But for our purposes, that is the lav, the negative command of accosting an individual. Now, just like in the case of chovel b'chavero, those two forms of punishment exist. The need for financial restitution plus malchus. What do we do in practice? Mamona mishali milkulo loki. When A hits B, what happens to Mr. A? He has to pay, has to compensate Mr. B. We don't find Mr. A getting lashed, even though he violated a negative command in the Torah. And the rule of thumb is that negative commands of the Torah carry with them a punishment of lashing. But that's not meted out in the case of chovel b'chavero. So to any case where you would have a similar situation, you would have a financial restitution and lashing. Mamona mishale milka loki. And now when we say af kol hecha, that includes our case of the forbidden, the rape with the forbidden woman. We said forbidden woman, we mean the forbidden relatives. So in the and as we mentioned before, even the standard case of rape also involves a type of chovel b'chavero. It's a type of chavola. Whatever the case is, in the case of rape, you certainly have a lav, the prohibition of the forbidden relative, and you've got the momon, the knas that needs to be paid. And we see, as Ula's conclusion is that when either one could have been meted out, Mammon will be paid, the money will be paid, and there will be no lashing. The Mishnah Makis, just to review, the Mishnah Makis that spoke about lashings because we set up a situation where there was no money to be paid, as we explained earlier. The Gemara now, as we said before, rejects this. Ma l'chovel b'chavero shekain chayev b'chamisha dvarim. You can't learn from chovel b'chavero to our case of rape. Chovel b'chavero, there by letter of the law, he should pay money. We're assuming for right now that the money punishment, the imposition of the need for financial restitution, that punishment is considered a more serious form of punishment, more than even lashing. That's the assumption we're making right now as we continue to speak. Chovel b'chavero is going to be charged money and not get lashing because chovel b'chavero happens to be a more severe type offense than a standard rape. Why is that? Because chovel b'chavero engenders 5 forms of financial restitution. Shekain chayav b'chamisha dvorim. The fact that chovel b'chavero generates 5 different forms of restitution, that puts chovel b'chavero in a category unto itself. It's a severe sin, a severe violation, more so than a simple case of rape. So as a result of that, I can't use, even if you leave the rape issue aside, we made a rule in Ula's name that any case that you have Momon and Malchus, you will pay the Momon, and he's learning that from Chovel B'Chavero. But how can you use Chovel B'Chavero as a precedent for all cases in the Torah where there's Momon and Malchus that he should have to pay? Chovel B'Chavero is more serious. And as we said in our assumption, as we said, according to our assumption that the money punishment is a more severe punishment, of course, for a more serious offense, you give the more serious punishment, the money payment. But from this to make a rule for all cases where you have Momon and Malchus, I'm not convinced. Only in the case of B'Chovel B'Chavero, I would say you have to pay the money, but I can't make a rule for all the rest of the Torah like that. The Gemara continues. V'i Momona Lakula. Here, the Gemara questions the assumption we were making. You might say, not like we assumed, rather, money is a more the need for making restitution is a more lenient form of punishment. Now, if you say that imposing a monetary obligation on someone, that is a more that's a lighter form of punishment. Now, and if you say that, then Ula's rule will be all the more strengthened, because if you say that we're going to give Chovel B'Chavero, which is a very serious offense, the lighter form of punishment, then when you have a less serious offense, Kal V'Chomer, certainly we will give the lesser form of punishment, namely financial restitution. If all of that is true, then I would have a basis for Ula's rule. To this, the Gemara responds, not so. I have a pircha even to that. And you know what the pircha is? The pircha is that Chovel V'Chavero itself might not be the big severe thing we said up till now. Chovel V'Chavero has an area of leniency that you don't find by other offenses. Shekain hutar michlolo bebeis din. Of course, it's usher, it's forbidden to hit somebody. That's a sin. But there is one example where you're allowed to hit someone. That's in the context of the court. The court is administering lashing. So we'll call it the sin of hitting is not as big a sin as other sins, as other offenses. This is a kind of sin that sometimes is allowed to be done. That's called hutur michlal. Hutur means it's allowed, it's removed from the klal, from the general rule of being prohibited. And where do we find a release from its general prohibition? That's in the case of Beis Din, in the case of the court. So that when we talk about the offense of Chovel B'Chavero, it cannot serve as a precedent for the rest of the Torah, that when you have Momon and Malchus, I'm automatically going to give the Momon punishment. I can't learn from Chovel B'Chavero. Why? Because it's a more lenient area of halacha than other areas. So from that standpoint, that's why we're going to give him the Momon punishment, working right now with the assumption that the Momon type punishment might be the lighter form of penalizing somebody. So either way you look at things, Chovel V'Chavero has two elements, we'll call two elements of extreme. Either you're looking at the Momon as the more severe form of penalizing someone. Well, that's because Chovel B'Chavero is a more severe form of offense in that it carries with it 5 forms of payment: nezek, tsar, sheves, ripui, and boishes. On the other hand, on the other extreme, you might say that the mamon payment is a more lenient form of penalizing someone, and still I can't learn from chovel b'chavero, because the very offense of chovel b'chavero is a lighter type offense insofar as it is actually permitted in the context of the court. So we have to leave that aside. Chovel v'chavero cannot be the source of the rule that we stated in the name of Ula, that wherever there's momon of malchus, momon mishalim milkile loki. Elo, number 2, gomar me'aidim zoymimim. We will use as our precedent the way the Torah treats the sin of lying witnesses in the context of Eidim Zom, a specific type of false testimony. Before we go too much further, I just want to point out that we have a topic heading that accompanies this section of Gemara, and let's read the topic heading. The nosei HaGemara Masika. The Gemara concludes, Aliba de Ula, according to Ula, D'cholecha di'iko momenu malchus, wherever you have either or, you have a chance to administer punishment-wise, either lashing or charge him momon, financial restitution. Yesh lahadif l'chayev momon v'lo malchus. We will opt to impose the financial penalty and not the lashing. The Gemara tries to prove this idea. Number 1, mechovel b'chavero. Number 2, me'edim zoymimim, which is the topic we're about to continue with in our Gemara text. Number 3, after we reject the Eidim Zomimim approach, then we're going to go to number 3, Mitzad Hashava Shebeneim. That will be by finding a common denominator between Chovel B'Chaverim and Eidim Zomimim. And finally, number 4, at the top of Omid Beis, Migzera Shava. Omid Beis, Muva B'Shitas Rabbi Yochanan Shesover Ha'efech. And then we'll try a Gzera Shava for the benefit of Ula, to serve as a basis for Ula. And eventually, as we saw earlier, when we get to Omid Beis, the Gemara will present Shitas Rabbi Yochanan that holds the opposite. Let's continue then in our Gemara text. Number 2, triangle number 2. How do we know Ula's rule? Wherever there's momon umalkis, momon mishalim milka loloki, elagomar me'edim zomim. And we learn from the way the Torah approaches the case of Eidim Zomim. Eidim Zomim it's a situation where you had testimony on the part of 2 witnesses, and they were followed by 2 other witnesses that said to the original fellows, how could you testify that you saw whatever you saw? Let's say the original witnesses testified they saw Mr. A borrow money from Mr. B. How can the second set of witnesses say about the first guys, how could you say that you saw Mr. A borrow from Mr. B when you were with us in a different place on that day that you claimed that A borrowed from B? So what did the first witnesses try to do? They tried to make A become indebted to Mr. B. They tried to make A pay money eventually to Mr. B because of a loan that he took, which he never took. They claimed that he took it, but they couldn't have testified because they were with these other guys on that day at the same time in a different place. So the first witnesses, they tried to make A pay Mr. B money that he never owed. Now, when they do that, the Torah says that we do to them, we punish them in the way they try to obligate the defendant. Just like they tried to make A pay money that he never owed, we make the witnesses, the Eidim Zoymimim, these phonies, we make them pay Mr. A. The loss that they tried to create, to impose on A, they have to now compensate him with that. Now, Eidim Zoymimim, in addition to that aspect of their behavior, and they're trying to cause financial loss, they also violated a negative command in the Torah. Lo san ebrecha eit shaker. Do not serve as a false witness. That's a lav. That's a negative command. We mentioned earlier that standard approach to negative commands is the administration of lashing to such offenders. So Edom Zomimim represent the dual offense, a financial offense and a violation of a negative command. And we continue now reading in the Gemara. Ma Edom Zomimim di'ika mamonu malkois. Just like in the case of Edom Zomimim, there's the mamon aspect, which is derived from the Torah, which says kasher zomam lasos. What they schemed to do to affect the defendant, they have to suffer. So just like they tried to impose a financial loss on the individual concerning whom they testified, they have to pay. There's also malchus for lo saneh b'reachet shoker. And how do we actually in practice deal with the Edom Zomimim? Mamona mishalem milka lo loki. They pay money. They do not get lashed. Af kol heichodiko momeno malchus. So to any offense in the Torah where both aspects are present, mamona mishalem milka lo loki. Here we have then a reinstatement of Ula's rule, meaning I say reinstate means an alternative source for Ula's rule. Just like by Edom Zomimim, both aspects appear, and we opt to impose the financial penalty and not the malchus. So too in all other places. The Gemara undoes this, challenges this, and the style here is very similar to the style of the Gemara just before. Just before in the case of the Chovel b'Chavero. Ma li'edem zomimim shekein einon tzrichim hasra. How can you allow Edom Zomim to serve as a precedent when it is a more serious offense than the rest of the Torah? In what sense? In the rest of the Torah, we don't give malchus, we don't administer punishment unless there is a warning ahead of time. And once again, I failed to mention, but I have to repeat, we're working right now with the assumption that mamon, the financial restitution, is a more severe form of punishment than lashing. Now, if we work with that assumption for the moment, we are then saying that we're giving the Edom Zomim this severe form of punishment, namely the need to pay. But the reason for that is because it's a type of offense that does not need to have a prior warning announced to the offender. Whereas in the rest of the Torah, before an offender commits an offense, and we mentioned this a few times in today's shiur in the context of giving malchus, which is a form of punishment. In fact, at this moment, a lighter form of punishment. You don't ever give that lighter form of punishment, even that lighter form of punishment, unless there's a prior warning. Not so in the case of Edom Zomimim. When those first witnesses came in, they weren't warned ahead of time. Oh, you better be careful and not lie, because if it turns out that you're lying, then you're going to get what you're trying to do to the other guy. So we see that the offense of Edom Zomimim is so serious that they don't deserve a warning beforehand. So, being that it's such a severe form of offense, that's why we punish them with the severe punishment of paying out money. But from that point to the rest of the Torah, the offender gets the benefit of receiving a hasra before the offense is committed in order to punish him. So I can't learn from Edom. It represents a level of offense uncharacteristic of the rest of the Torah, so it can't serve as a precedent. Ve'i mamona lekulahu. And if you argue that, hey, 1 second, money payment is actually a lighter form of punishment than lashing. And if that be the case, here we've got this serious offense called Eidim Zomim, and they're getting the lighter form of punishment. We can now make a Kal V'chomer. Here, for the serious offense, we give a lighter punishment, all the more so for the rest of the Torah, which is less serious. Certainly they'll get the lighter form of punishment, namely the money payment. Even so, I will not be able to use Eidim Zomimim as the precedent for the rest of the Torah. Why not? Shekain loy asu maisa. Eidim Zomimim is a type of offense that's verbal. It's non-action oriented. And therefore, if I were to compare Eidim Zomim to the rest of the Torah, it's a lighter form of offense. And therefore, it gets the lighter form of punishment, meaning pay out the money. That's what we're saying at this point. And as far as other areas of the Torah where there is a maisa that characterizes the offense, it's an offense with an action, not just speech, but an action. Maybe there I would give malchus and not mammon. So I can't say based on Eidim Zomimim that wherever you have mammon and malchus, we see that you give the mammon. Ella, so what's the basis? What's going to serve as the basis for Ula's conclusion that wherever there's mammon and malchus, mammon mishalim milkululaki elo gomar mitravayu, we will use a common denominator between the cases of Eidim Zomim and Chovel V'Chavero to come to this conclusion. Ma hatzad hashava shebahen. What's common between Chovel V'Chavero and Eidim Zomimim? The two disparate offenses, and yet there's something common. The Iko Mammon and Malchus, both Chovel V'Chavero and Eidim Zomim have these two possible punishments associated with them, Mammon and Malchus. And what do we see happening? Money is paid and there's no lashing. So to the rest of the Torah, wherever you have a case of Mammon and Malchus, take for example, we didn't use an example before, but just think about this for a second. Imagine someone steals some pig meat from his friend. He steals a piece of ham from his friend. The guy was going to use the ham to feed his cats. So I come along and steal the ham from so and so, and I eat it. So there's an offense of mammon, of stealing, and there's an offense of eating ham, which is a lav in the Torah. So in all cases where you have mammon and malchus, mamona mishale milkuloloki will tell the guy pay the money and not experience the malchus. By the way, just on a technical level, the example that I gave is subject to questioning and debate. We'll see some debate on some reference to this later in the sugya, but for our purposes, we're just trying to use a superficial illustration to demonstrate a case where there's mammon and malchus. The Gemara says, and again we see a pircha coming up, an undoing of number 3. Ma l'hatzad hashava shebohen. How can you use the common denominator of Chovel and Eidim Zomimim? Shekain yesh bohen tzad chomor. Both of them, and here we have little arrows. Use your arrows. Would you not agree that Chovel b'Chavero had a certain chomor aspect to it? Well, the first arrow on the page, we noted there, it said chayav b'chamisha dvorim. You have 5 different types of financial compensation that must be made. That's unusual. 5 different forms of financial restitution that must be made. That's a tzad chomor. And once again, like we've done already twice so far, we're making an assumption for the moment that the money punishment is a more severe form of punishment than lashing. So that you could say, look, as far as these 2 areas of law, Chovel b'Chavero, and Edom Zoma also has a severe aspect to it. The other arrow, the second arrow, pointed to the line where it said they don't need hasra. They don't get the benefit of a warning before their offense. So that's why we give them the more severe form of punishment, pay the money. So I can't learn from Chovel B'Chavero and Edom Zomim. They have a tzad chomor to them. And if you argue that, hey, 1 second, money payment is actually a lower form of punishment, and then you would make a kal v'chomer, you would say, oh, for these things that have a tzad chomer to them, Chovel B'Chavero and Edom Zomim, which are serious offenses, each one with its own respective characteristic of severity, and yet we give the lighter form of punishment, all the more so I'll give the lighter form of punishment, the mammon payment. Actually, that's right, the mammon payment for lesser forms of offense. Nevertheless, we still cannot use the tzad hashaveh. Shekain yesh bohen tzad hakal. We have arrows. You notice on the left-hand side of the Gemara text. Use the arrows. Once we make the assumption that momon is actually more kal, we still can't make the kal v'chomer that we just suggested, because Chovel B'Chavero and Edom Zomim themselves represent something that have an extreme lenient side to them. What was the lenient side to the Chovel B'Chavero? Huter Michlolo B'Beis. What was the lenient side of Edom Zomim? Lo Asu Maisa. So I can't use these areas of halacha, not Edom Zomim, not Chovel B'Chavero, as a means of creating a rule for the rest of the Torah, that wherever there's Mamon and Malkis, Mamon and Mishalim, Milkulu Loki. We continue at the top of Amud Beis, Ela Ula, Tachas Gomar. This is the fourth triangle. Gomar means he has a tradition of Gezerah Shav. He learns a Gezerah Shav word comparison between these topics. Ksiv Hacha, it says by Oynes, it says Tachas Asher Ina, that he has to pay the fine of 50 shekel kesef because of raping her. The Uksiv Hasam, it says by Chovel B'Chavero, Aryan Tachas Aryan. That's what literally eye for an eye, but that's a case where you hit someone. And we know that from the Gemara in Bava Kama, which it speaks about this issue extensively, Ayin Tachas Ayin means payment. Ma Hasam, just like in the case of Chovel B'Chavero, Momen Sham Milkuloloki, he pays money, does not get lashed for having attacked his friend. Af Kol Hecha. So to wherever you have Mamon Amalkis, Mamon Mishalim, Milka Loloki. Instead of saying wherever, we can limit it to our case over here of the Oynes, because that's really the topic at hand. So too, in the case of Ones, we will say Mamon Mishalim, Milka Loloki. Therefore, we now have a basis for Ulah's principle, so that Ula resolved the two Mishnayos, one in Maseches Makis and our Mishnah, and our Mishnah speaks about paying Knas. That's because wherever you have a Mammon and Malkis, you pay Mammon and no Malkis. The Mishnah in Maseches Makis, as Ula explained, the reason there is Malkis is because it's under circumstances where there was no Mammon to be paid in the first place. And as we said, we come to the second crown shape, the second attempt to resolve the sources between Maseches Kesubos, our Mishnah, and Maseches Makis. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Afilu Tema Achoso Nara. You can say that the Mishnah in Makis is talking about a case of Nara, which means that there is we'll say, a potential for Mammon there as well. This approach is different than Ula's approach. The way Ula set up the Mishnah Makis is that the Mishnah Makis is talking about a case where there is no knas to be paid, because the way Ula originally explained the Mishnah there, he said there it's talking about achoso bogeres. Bogeres, as we explained, there would be no malchus. Rabbi Yochanan is saying no, afilu tema. You can even say that the Mishnah in Makis is talking about achoso naro, sisters in naro, where there is the potential for knas, the 50 shekel kesef payment. Kan shehisrubo. Kan shelo hisrubo. The Mishnah Makis is talking about a circumstance where there was a warning given ahead of time that there would be lashes if you do the offense. And our Mishnah in Kesubos shelo hisrubo, there was no warning given ahead of time. Since there's no warning, you can't give the lashing. If you can't give the lashing, so you have to punish him somehow. So we punish him with the knas, pay the money. Alma Kosav Rabbi Yochanan. From this you see that Rabbi Yochanan has an approach that kol hechodiko moment of malchus ve'asrube, wherever there is the potential of mammon and lashing, which is a result of their having issued a warning. Milka loki mammon lo mishalem. There is only malchus given, no money is paid. From where does Rabbi Yochanan know this? Omar Kro Kidei Rishoso. The Pasuk says, in the context of lashing, it says Kidei Rishoso. Mishum Risho Achas Ato Mechayvo V'iyato Mechayvo Mishum Shtei Rishoyos. V'somech le Arboim Yakenu. And next to the Pasuk of Kidei Rishoso, which means Mishum Risho Achas Ato Mechayvo, for our purposes means where you give him one punishment and not two punishments. So that if you have a person that is we'll say a candidate for two punishments, you give him only one. And what's the one punishment that you give him? Well, it says in Pasuk Gimel, which follows the Kidei Rishoso phrase in Pasuk Beis, it says in Pasuk Gimel, Arbaim Yakenu. You give him the 40 lashes. So the basis for Rabbi Yochanan is the psukim that are next to one another in Vorim Perach Chav Hei, psukim Beis and Gimel. And just to repeat, you see from the psukim that wherever you have the potential of two punishments, as is indicated by, let's say, the inference in the word Kidei Rishoso, means you give him only one punishment. That indicates that the fellow is potentially subject or potentially liable to two punishments. But the Torah says, okay, he's liable to two punishments, but you give him only one. And what is the one? The lashing. You can see that there is a very long bracketed section, a little reminiscent of the Gemara Omar Aleph. On the side there's a starred note, Matras Sograim Elu. The purpose of these brackets, Hino Ledaleg, is for skipping. Kedei Lirois Bo'ifin Miodi, My Taimo Rabbi Yochanan Lolome Keula. We want to be able to see immediately, why did Rabbi Yochanan choose the approach that he did and didn't follow Ula's approach? So if you skip the bracketed section, you see at the bottom line, Rabbi Yochanan, my time alo amar kula. Why did Rabbi Yochanan prefer Malchus and not learn like Ula that preferred Mammon? And the Gemara then will go on with a give and take style Gemara, which we'll present with some markings when we get there. Besoch hasograyim, within the bracketed section, HaGemara makshe ala klal she Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara will challenge Rabbi Yochanan's rule, mechayvel bechavero, the anu madifim tashlum. We see other cases where you've got both potential punishments, and we specifically prefer the financial punishment, not like Rabbi Yochanan claims. So that will be the subject of our of the bracketed section. Before we go through the Gemara text in the brackets, we mentioned that why is it that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn like La? So just to get a little taste of that, we skip to the bottom line. Rabbi Yochanan, my time lo makula. Why did Rabbi Yochanan, who says we prefer Malchus and not Mammon, why doesn't he say prefer Mammon? He answers, Im kain bitalta ervasa chayscha lo sigale. If you impose Mammon, then I'm not working according to the Torah's expectation that a negative command has been violated. Namely, he raped his sister. The pasuk says, "Ervas al choscha," the intimacy of one sister you shall not reveal, meaning you shouldn't have intimacy with your sister. And there's a low word that we emphasize with a squiggle underlined that represents malchus, that represents a negative command that's been violated. Negative commands generate malchus. And if you're going to go like Ula, then you're not going to fulfill the Torah's expectation of giving malchus. Well, that gives you a flavor of why Rabbi Yochanan is avoiding the Ula approach. However, that discussion continues down a number of lines on Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. But so when we get there, we'll go over that point. Now we go to the bracketed section. The Gemara has a long question. This question you see with the long question marking takes you to the fourth wide line. We just said, according to Rabbi Yochanan, a rule of the Torah that wherever you have Mammon and Malchus, we impose Mammon and not Malchus. V'harei choyvel b'chaveroi. Injuring one's friend, the iko Mammon and Malchus, it's a type of offense that has both aspects, as we explained earlier. Mamona mishalim milka lo loki. We see that we impose the Mammon payment and no Malchus. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Just to restate Rabbi Yochanan, I might have said it inaccurately just a few seconds ago. Rabbi Yochanan's approach is milka loki mamona lo mishalim. You impose Malchus, not Mammon. And according to the way we deal with Chayvel Chavero, the opposite. We impose Mammon and not Malchus. So, what does Rabbi Yochanan say about that? You might want to say, now, here we have a situation where the Gemara raises a possible answer, but it will be rejected. So you might want to say, Hani Mili, why in the case of Mammon, of Chayvel B'Chavero, is there Mammon? Hani Mili Heichadolo Asrube, because there was no warning ahead of time. Avol Asrube, had there been a warning which would enable us to give Malchus, Milki Loki Mamoino Lo Mishalim, then even Chayvel B'Chavero, there would be Malchus and not Mammon. But that's not true. And here we dashed on Rabbi Yochanan because we're in the midst of analyzing Rabbi Yochanan himself. Here Rabbi Yochanan himself says, she'ein bo shave pruta loike. If a person hit his friend, causing very slight injury, and a type of injury that's so insignificant that it doesn't value, it can't be evaluated even to the tune of a pruta. Pruta being the smallest form of currency. So it's a very minor injury that you inflicted on your friend. What does Rabbi Yochanan say? Loke, he gets lashed. Heichidomi, what are the circumstances behind this action? Idolo asrube, if there was no warning ahead of time that you'll be subject to lashing on my loke, how could you give him lashes? Elapshita, the asrube. It's obvious that this statement of Rabbi Yochanan is under circumstances where there was hasra, where the offender was warned ahead of time. V'taima, why is he getting lashed? The less bosh of a pruta, because it was so insignificant financially, so we can't charge him, there's nothing to charge him, so we give him lashes. However, had there been a shave pruta value of injury, mamona mishale milka lo lucky, there would have been a money payment and no malchus, even though that there was hasra. So that the v'chi temo answer that we gave before, that why in chayvel b'chavero is there money that's paid is because there was no hasra, that's not true. So we're at this point we reached the end of our long question, and the emphasis is, you see from chayvel b'chavero, even though there are two violations, there's the mamon and the malchus aspect, only money is paid and not malchus. What did Rabbi Yochanan himself say before? Malchus, not mamon. The Gemara answers, Kid Omar Rabbi Ilah, based on Rabbi Ilah, who will be presented a bit later, Beferish Rib Sotura Eidim Zomimim L'Tashlumin. Rabbi Ilah referred to the topic of Eidim Zomimim, where he says that the Torah goes out of its way to specify money payment with regard to Eidim Zomimim, even though Eidim Zomimim also has a Malchus aspect to it, but there's a Gzeres HaKosov, a special Torah teaching, a special Torah provision by Eidim Zomimim that only money is paid. Hachanami, so to here by Chayvel B'Chavero B'Feirush Ribsatura Chayvel B'Chavero Tashlumin. Here the Torah went out of its way to make a provision for financial restitution by Chayvel B'Chavero, but not so with regard to the rest of the Torah. So in simple Talmudic terms, there's a Gzeres HaKosov that is the basis for Chayvel B'Chavero paying money. But outside of Chayvel B'Chavero, outside of Eidim Zomimim, the rule of thumb is Milkeloki Mamona Loi Mishalem. Now we have, marking wise, we see an internal brackets. This angular bracket, which is featured or explained by the note on the side, Hesber HaSograyim, Acharei Shagmora Tirtza HaKushya Mechayvel B'Chavero, Al Pi Divrei Rebbe Ilah. After the Gemara answered the question that we raised from Chayvel B'Chavero, we asked on Rabbi Yochanan from that case, and we answered it based on Rebbe Ilah. Within the bracketed section, the basis of that answer will be presented. So the Gemara asks, V'hecha itma de Rebbe Ilah. We just justified, we'll say, Rabbi Yochanan's answer, or Rabbi Yochanan's position, and it's his position, or the defense of his position from the question of Chayvel B'Chavero. We defended his position by employing Rabbi Ilah. Well, where did Rabbi Ilah say his point? And by the way, when we cited Rabbi Ilah spoke about Eidim Zomimim paying money and not, and paying only money, not getting lashed. V'hecha idma de Rav Ilah. Where did Rav Ilah appear? Aha, regarding the following. We have a Tanaic source. In this Tanaic source, you're going to notice the opinions of Reb Meir and finally the Chachamim. What we're going to really want to focus on is the opinion of the Chachamim, so it's worth knowing that ahead of time. The following source. Two witnesses say that we testify that Mr. A owes Mr. B 200 zuz. Zuz being a form of currency. V'nimtzu zomim, and those two witnesses that said that A is chayav to B, they wanted to impose an obligation on A to pay B, they turn out to be zomimim. They couldn't have testified because they were with two other fellows at the same time in a different place. Loikin u'mishalmin, we give them lashing and we also expect them to pay. Shelo Hashem hamavion lidei makis. The Lo Hashem is a reference to the source in the Torah that would bring them to makis. There's a pasuk Lo san evreacha b'eit shaker. That's not the same source, Mevian Lidei Tashlumin. The source in the Torah that would impose money on them is a separate pasuk. Kasher Zomam Lasos Lachiv. So since they're two separate sources for that describe the punishment needed to impose on Eidim Zomim, they're two separate sources. We give the individual, the offenders here, the both punishments. That's Rabbi Meir's approach. V'chachamim omrim kol ha'mishalem eino lokeh. The Chachamim disagree, and they say if someone's paying, he's not going to get lashed. V'neimo kol ha'loikeinu mishalem. Why not say the opposite, that he who gets lashed doesn't have to pay? Or in more simple terms, according to the Chachamim, why are they saying that the Edom Zomim pay and don't get lashed, that the Edom Zom get lashed and not pay? Amar Rabbi Yehonasan, and we have a special marking here. We'll come back to it in a second. Amar Rabbi Yehonasan, beferish ribsuter Edom Zomimim l'tashlumin. The Torah went out of its way to make a special provision by Edom Zomimim that they are to pay. They're to pay and not get lashed. Let's glance at the side for a moment. We have a nosei mivneh heading, and we indicate this goes to Lamed Gimel Amid Beis. The bow tie shape, Havlotas Rabbonim, will be to highlight different names. Litzur Kesher in Lamed Gimel Amid Aleph, Lamed Gimel Beis. Here we are on Lamed Beis Amid Beis. We want to create a connection between these three amudim of Gemara. The diamond marking will be used to highlight Edom Zomimim v'chevel b'chavero. Muva kan u'ba'amudim haboyim, there is presented here and in upcoming pages of Gemara. Makoros the dvorim elu mishalmin mamon dafka. Sources. We're going to see a variety of sources regarding these two topics, Edom Zomimim v'chevel b'chavero, that payment alone is made. Yesh l'ha'ir, we want to point out, Reb Ilo maybe Makoros l'shneim. Reb Ilo will present sources for both. You know, under Reb Ilo's name, under his name at least, structurally or visually, under his name, we'll see sources for both. Reb Ozer on Lamed Gimel Amid Aleph, he brings a source for Edom Zomim. So if you have Lamed Gimel Amid Aleph available, skim down until you find the bow tie, and you'll see that he deals with the topic of Edom Zomimim and their obligation of paying. We'll then see on also Lamed Gimel Aleph Rav Shisha. He's further down the Amid, and he brings a mocker that deals with Chovel B'Chavero. And on Lamed Gimel Amid Beis, you will see Rav Yankiv, also in a diamond, in a bow tie, on the upper fifth of the page, Rav Yankiv Nar Pakod, and he deals with the topic of Chovel B'Chavero. So, hopefully we've mapped out that section of Gemara as well in the context of today's shiur, so we're not going to get to all of that. It's good to know ahead of time that we're trying to create this connection. The theme, though, is that these areas of halacha, Edom Zomimim and Chovel B'Chavero, only payment is made and not lashing. What is the reason for that? So we continue in our Gemara. Reb Ilo said that befeirush Torah, notice we are 5 lines from the bottom, the Torah went out of its way to make a special provision, Edom Zomimim l'tashlumim, that they pay. Heichon ribsotor, where is that? Mifti ksiv, let's look into this. And you see that it's written as follows. V'asisim lo yikasher zomam lasos lo'achiv. It says in the Torah that you shall do to them, to the phony witnesses, what they tried to impose on the defendant. The pasuk also says, Yad biyad, lomoli. The psukim themselves, you can open up the Chumash in Sefer Dvorim Posuk Yutes and see the entire discussion as far as the verses are concerned. But for our purposes, we want to focus on the Gzeres HaKosov aspect of things. After telling us that you do to them what they try to do to the defendant, the Torah says, Yad biyad. What is that for? The answer is, Dovar hanitan miyad liyad, umay nihu mamon. That when it comes to the Edom Zomimim, they are to be penalized with paying money. Yad biyad means that which you transfer from hand to hand. What do you give? What does one give from himself to the next person? Money. Chovel b'chavero nami Mifti Ksiv. It says, Kasher also Ken Yaselo. As he tried to do, we do to him. So the Chovel B'Chaver is someone that tried to injure someone. So he injured someone. So just like he injured so and so, well, let's punish him. Kain Yinosein Bo Lomali. This would seem to be a repeat expression. You said Kain Yaselo, and then you go on and say in the same context, you say Kain Yinosein Bo. What do you mean by that? So we darshan Dovar Sheyesh Bo Nesina. Yinosein Bo refers to something that you have the ability of giving from one to the other. What do you hand over? Nesina means you hand over from one to the other. Mind you, what is it that you hand over from one to the other? Mamon, money. So we have special Xeris HaKosovs for Eidim Zoma Chovel Chavero, that money is the form of punishment. But in the rest of the Torah, if it's Malchus versus Mammon, Rabbi Yochanan will tell you Malchus is imposed, not Mammon. The Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan, my time alo Omar Ke'ula. Rabbi Yochanan, who preferred Malchus, why does he not go like Ula? And you'll notice we have a new marking, a triangle that appears in two different directions. This triangle is colored in its tips to distinguish it from other triangles on this page. You have a give and take. We call this on the side under our Mivneh heading the ma'akav, attempt to keep track of the back and forth. So the triangle pointing up represents she'elos or kushios, questions or difficulties that are raised. Levarer lama Rabbi Yochanan lo amar kula. Why does Rabbi Yochanan not say like Ula? And the inverted triangle are responses. So we ask, why does Rabbi Yochanan not say like Ula? Why is Rabbi Yochanan so interested in imposing Malchus? And if you want to bring things closer to home, when a brother rapes his sister, so the Mishnah and Malchus, where there was warning as well, we give him Malchus and we do not impose the money payment. Why is it so important for Rabbi Yochanan to see the Malchus meted out? Answer, in Cain, because if you would not give Malchus, you would have voided, you would have canceled what the Torah expects. The Torah says that if someone has intimacy with his sister, he is in violation of a negative command, and a negative command means that there's Malchus. And if you're not going to give the Malchus, so then you're canceling the Torah's expectation. We continue at the top of Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. Chovel b'chavero nami. What does Rabbi Yochanan agree with regard to Chovel b'chavero and Eidim Zomimim? In both of those cases, he says money is paid. But in both of those cases, as the Gemara is going to point out instantly, the Gemara will show us that there is a negative command violated. Chovel b'chavero nami im kain bitalta lo Yosef pen Yosef. Those are the psukim that represent the negative command for attacking, for accosting a fellow Jew. So there's a negative command, and yet we don't lash them. And Eidim Zomimim Nami, which we say they pay and no lashing. In Cain, we bitalta v'hoya in bin hakois harasha. This is a pasuk in the context of Eidim Zomimim. Notice we dashed on the line hakois. The Torah seems to expect us to give Malchus to the Eidim Zomimim, yet we don't do that. So that if what's bothering you, Rabbi Yochanan, is this concept of bitalta, you're mevatel the loisas of the Torah, we do that. We do it by Eidim Zomimim. We do it by Chovel b'chavero. It doesn't seem to bother us, and we punish the fellow with the mammon and not give the Malchus. Ella. So there's a rather Eidim Zomimim efsher lekumi b'ben grusha ben chalutza. Chovel b'chavero nami hiko lekumo Kigon shiko akol shebo shova pruta. Achosonami ikolikumo ba'choso bogeres. This issue of being mevatel this loisase, you see that it's not really true, because even in the case of Edom Zomimim and Chovel B'Chavero, there is an aspect of those offenses where I preserve the malkos. As long as I can show you an aspect of those offenses where the malkos, where the lashing is preserved, then in other aspects of those offenses, I can relinquish that. I can forego the malkos. As long as I at least preserve in theory, or not only in theory, but in practice, one case of malkos by each one respectively, that's enough for me. That's enough for preserving the Torah. And the other cases, I can say that there's a mamon payment. That having been said, achoso is the same thing. Achoso, I can fulfill the malkos in the case of achoso bogeres, and all other cases of boal achoso, we can impose money. So why does Rabbi Yochanan mechayev malkos even in the case of achoso nara, where there's a money issue at hand? Just to repeat, if you're worried about the fact that by imposing money, I'm going to mevatel the loisaseh of ervas achoso l'sigala, no, I'm not mevatel that. I'm not voiding it. I'll be able to fulfill that in the case of someone who has relations with achoso bogeres, where there is no knas payment. So, with that in mind, why does Rabbi Yochanan say that even in the case of achoso nara, is there malchus? There shouldn't be. The Gemara will answer that. We'll answer on behalf of Rabbi Yochanan. But before we get to the answer, let's go over the Gemara again. We read it rather quickly. And now go over the Gemara with more of an explanation. So, as we said, the Chovel B'Chavero and Edom Zomimim didn't seem to bother Rabbi Yochanan and the bittul lav bitalta loisase aspect, because, and here we're going to read the Gemara from the third line from the top, Elo Edom Zomimim efshir l'kiyuma beben grusha ben chalutza. Case of false witnesses that testify about so-and-so that he is a son of a Kohen who married a divorcee or a woman who did chalitza. So what did these Edom Zomimim try to do? They tried to make a son of a Kohen a non-Kohen. Can you imagine Edom Zomimim themselves being made into a ben grusha ben chalutza? You can't do that. Certainly if the Edom themselves are not Kohanim to begin with. So what they tried to do to the defendant to claim that he is a cholol, you can't impose that on the Edom Zom. So what do we do in such a case? The Torah says, and this is a discussion in Tractate Makis and Maseches Makis itself, what do we do with those kind of Edom? We give them malchus. So it's true, in general, Edom Zomimim have to pay when they try to impose payment on someone else. However, if you have a situation where we can't give to them what they wanted to give to the victim, to the defendant, they get malchus. So I preserve the malchus of Edom Zomimim in that case. Chovel b'chavero nami, we saw this earlier. As far as Chovel b'Chavero is concerned, the fact that in general I expect them to make financial restitution, that doesn't constitute a canceling of the loisas, of the lav aspect of Chovel b'Chavero, because there remains a fulfillment of the lav aspect where someone hits his friend, he attacks his friend, causing a very minor injury, an injury less than a shove pruta in value. In such a case, so I can't impose the financial punishment. And what do? We lash the offender. So What have we demonstrated so far with regard to these two areas where in general payment is made, and at the same time I have found a case where I do not cancel the lo sase lashing aspect of those offenses? As far as raping one's sister, I can fulfill the lo sase aspect. I can fulfill the lo sase aspect ba'achoso bogeres, when he, let us say, he would rape his sister that's a bogeres. Namely, there's no knas payment when she's above 12 and a half. And with regard to a achoso na'ara, where there is a knas payment, I will impose the money punishment. Let him pay the knas, and not malchus. And yet Rabbi Yochanan said that even Boal Achoso Nara, he gets malchus. That's how he explained the Mishnah in Maseches Makis. Well, why should that be? And now you can't tell me, because if we don't give the malchus, I mean mevatel the ervas achoso lo segala. That's not true. I'm not mevatel ervas achoso lo segala. I'll fulfill that pasuk when it comes to achoso bogeres. So why did Rabbi Yochanan not say like Ula? Ella, answer. Rabbi Yochanan, Hai tachas asher ina. Remember that pasuk? That was Ula's mukar for paying. He had a gzeira shava. But Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm sorry, I can't use that as the way Ula did. I, Rabbi Yochanan, need that pasuk, the Ula pasuk, for something else. I need it for Abaye's teaching. Domar Abaye. Omar Kro, Tachas Asher Ina. Here's that same pasuk. Hi Tachas Asher Ina. The fact that it says that the pasuk says that he pays the 50 pieces of silver. Tachas Asher Ina. Michlal. This implies that the 50 payment covers the rape. Michlal the Ika Boishes of Gam. It implies that there are other money payments to be made as well. So what Abaye teaches, and this is what Rabbi Yochanan says, that one should not think that the 50 shekel kesef that a person pays when he rapes, that covers everything. No, it doesn't cover everything. That's a superimposed fine. But in addition to that, there are other payments that are made. For example, the payment for embarrassment, the payment for depreciation. There's the tsar, there's the sheves, there's the boish, there's the ripoy. If there's medical expenses that are incurred, those must also be compensated for, in addition to the 50 shekel kesef, which is accounted for by the pasuk tachas asher ina. For the ina, for the rape, there is the 50. The other. But there are additional payments as well. Ve'ula nafka le midorava. Now that very point that we just heard by Rabbi Yochanan citing Tachas Ina as Abaye does, that tells me that the 50 does not cover all the payments. Ula learns that from Rava, from the way Rava would approach it. The Omar Rava, Omar Krov, Nosanu Isha Shoiche Vimola Vianaro, Chamishim Kesef. The pasuk says that he will pay 50 pieces of silver to the father of the girl that he raped, and we learn from this his Rava's inference style. Hanoas Shchiva Chamishim. The 50 is for the intimacy per se, for the rape per se, but Michlal, that implies that the Iko Boishis Ubagam, that for the rape, that's what the 50 covers. But there are other payments too. So we're inferring from we're inferring from that besides the Shchiva, there are other payments that need to be made, indicating that the 50 does not cover everything. So at this point in the Gemara, which in the context of the Daf Yomi shiur, we'll have to pause textually at this point. However, we have seen so far the seeming contradiction between the Mishnah in Makis and our Mishnah here in Kesubos. We saw Ula's method of resolution. We saw Reb Yochanan's method of resolution. Amir Tzashem on Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, Reish Lakish will present his method of resolving that contradiction. And as we indicated, further on in the sugya, there will be even another approach. In the course of the discussion, we presented the cases of Eidim Zomimim and Chayvil B'Chavero as being examples of offenses that have both a Momon aspect and a Malkos aspect. And in those cases, Eidim Zomim and Chayvil B'Chavero, we saw that we only expect, in general, we expect only Momon to be paid and not Malkos. And that will become though we did mention it already, we saw Reb Ilah refer to that. We'll see more discussion on that topic, and those opinions or those points of discussion are introduced with bow tie shapes. That will, Amir Tzashem, take us till Lamed Gimel Amud Beis. But once again, in the context of Daf Yomi, we've come to the end of our shiur today.